There are stories that arrive like thunder crashing through the night sky with drama and spectacle, demanding your attention with every crackling bolt. And then, there are stories that drift in like afternoon shadows, soft and unhurried, settling into the quiet spaces between your thoughts like dust. Motes floating through slanted sunlight. This is one of those quieter stories. It begins not with epic battles or tragic romances, not with curses shouted from mountaintops or prophecies carved into temple walls. No, this story begins on a perfectly unremarkable afternoon in ancient Greece, when even the gods themselves grew drowsy under the weight of the Mediterranean sun. Picture, if you will, the hills of Arcadia in midsummer. The olive groves stretch endlessly across the landscape, their silvery leaves whispering secrets to the warm breeze that barely has the energy to move. The cicadas drone their eternal song, that hypnotic rhythm that seems to make time itself slow down, stretching each moment into something thick and honey-sweet. The dust on the ancient paths lies undisturbed. The shepherds have found shade beneath the twisted trunks of carob trees, their flocks scattered across the hillside in white clusters, too lazy even to graze. The world has entered that sacred hour of afternoon rest, that time when ambition dissolves and even the most restless hearts find themselves yawning. In this world, this Greece of long ago, the gods walked among mortals more freely than you might imagine, but they weren't always the dramatic figures of legend, hurling lightning bolts and transforming unfortunate lovers into laurel trees. Sometimes, especially on afternoons like these, they were remarkably ordinary. They grew bored. They napped. They invented things by accident. Our story concerns one such god. On one such afternoon, in one such accident, an invention so simple, so unremarkable, that you've probably never given it a second thought. Yet without it, the entire course of civilization might have walked a different path. Or perhaps not. Perhaps everything would have been exactly the same, just with sorer feet. Either way, let us drift back together to that drowsy afternoon on Mount Selene, where a young god named Hermes was about to stumble upon an idea that would quite literally change the way the world walked. Not because he was trying to change anything, mind you. Not because he had grand ambitions or divine inspiration. Simply because he was bored, and his hands needed something to do, and there happened to be some goat hide lying around. The greatest inventions, you see, often begin with the simplest accidents. And on this particular afternoon, as the sun climbed to its apex, and the whole world seemed to hold its breath in the heat, an accident was quietly waiting to happen. Mount Selene rises from the heart of Arcadia like a sleeping giant, its peaks catching the first light of dawn and the last glow of evening. But at midday, when the sun reaches its full strength, even this ancient mountain seems to surrender to the heat. The rocks radiate warmth, like bread fresh from an oven. The pine trees cease their restless swaying, everything stone, plant, animal. And God falls into a kind of communal drowsiness. It was in a cave halfway up this mountain that young Hermes lived with his mother, Maia. Now, when I say young, I use the term loosely. Hermes was young for a god, which meant he had only existed for a few centuries. In divine years, he was barely past infancy, though he'd already accomplished more mischief than most deities. Manage in millennia. You may have heard some of those stories. How he stole Apollo's cattle on the very day he was born. How he invented the lyre from a tortoise shell and some sheep gut, creating music itself as casually as you might doodle in the margins of a notebook. Hermes had a gift for invention, you see. His mind was constantly moving, constantly tinkering, constantly seeking the next clever trick or useful tool. But on this particular afternoon, the afternoon that concerns our story, Hermes wasn't feeling particularly clever. He was feeling something much more mundane. Bored. The cave was cool, at least. Its entrance faced northeast, away from the brutal afternoon sun, and the deep interior maintained a pleasant temperature even in the height of summer. Maia had arranged it comfortably over the years. Soft furs covered the sleeping alcoves. Clay pots lined the walls, filled with honey and dried figs and other provisions. A small fire pit sat in the center, though it remained unlit during these warm months. Hermes lay sprawled on a flat rock near the entrance. One arm draped dramatically over his eyes, the very picture of youthful ennui. He had already tried napping twice, but sleep wouldn't come. His mind was too active, too restless. He'd attempted to practice his lyre playing, but even music felt like too much effort in this heat. He'd considered sneaking down to the valleys to play tricks on the shepherds, but the thought of walking all that way in the blazing sun made him groan aloud. Staying out of trouble for once? Maya's voice drifted from deeper in the cave, tinged with amusement. She was weaving at her loom, the rhythmic clack-clack of the shuttle providing a steady percussion to the afternoon's stillness. "I'm dying of boredom," Hermes declared. "With all the dramatic flair of youth, how do mortals endure this? Day after day of nothing happening." "They rest," Maya said simply. "They accept that not every moment requires adventure. Rest is for the old," Hermes muttered, though without much conviction. The heat was making even complaining feel like too much work. He turned onto his side, his divine eyes scanning the cave floor without really seeing it. A few of his past projects lay scattered about: bits of string, a half-carved piece of olive wood, some strips of leather left over from repairing his mother's sandals last month. Or was it last year? Time moves strangely for gods. Days and decades had a way of blurring together, especially on lazy afternoons like this. Outside, a lone bee droned past the cave entrance, its humming adding another layer to the symphony of sleepiness. Somewhere downslope, a goat bleated a half-hearted sound that trailed off as if the animal had forgotten midway through why it was making noise at all. Hermes' fingers drummed against the rock. Then he reached out idly and snagged one of the leather strips, pulling it toward him without sitting up. The leather was supple, well-tanned goat hide that had been treated with olive oil and beeswax to keep it from cracking. It felt pleasant under his fingertips, smooth and pliable. He began to fold it absently, creasing it this way and that, his hands occupying themselves while his mind wandered. This was how many of his inventions began, not with grand plans or divine inspiration, but with restless hands that couldn't stay still. His fingers were always seeking textures, testing tensions, exploring possibilities. What made Hermes different from other gods wasn't his power, or his beauty, or his wisdom. It was this: he couldn't help but tinker. Where Zeus saw the world as something to rule, and Athena saw it as something to understand, Hermes saw it as something to play with. Every object was a puzzle, every material a potential toy, every problem an invitation to improvise. "You're fidgeting again, Maya," observed without looking up from her weaving. "Mothers always know." "I'm thinking," Hermes corrected. "Thinking and fidgeting aren't mutually exclusive with you." She was right, of course. Hermes' best thoughts came through his hands, not his head. Ideas formed in the doing and the testing, in the accidental discoveries that happened when you stopped trying so hard to be brilliant. He sat up slowly, the leather strip dangling from his fingers like a limp snake. The movement took effort. The heat seemed to press down on him like an invisible weight. But now that he was upright, his curiosity was beginning to stir that itch at the back of his mind that signaled something interesting might be about to happen. More leather strips lay scattered nearby, some twine too, and a few odds and ends he'd collected from his various expeditions. His eyes tracked over them with growing interest. Not focused interest, just that vague, half-formed sense that there might be something worth doing here after all. But what? That was always the question that drove him forward into discovery. That single syllable that contained infinite possibilities. What? What could he make? What might work? What would happen if he tried? The afternoon stretched ahead of him, vast and empty and full of potential. Outside, the world dozed. Inside the cave, a young god's restless mind was beginning to wake up, and somewhere in the pile of leather scraps and string at his feet, an invention was waiting to be born, though Hermes didn't know it yet. All he knew was that his hands were itching to make something, and the afternoon was still young. Well, young enough. The cave fell quiet except for the steady rhythm of Maha's loom. Clack, clack. Clack, clack. The sound was hypnotic. Meditative. The kind of repetitive pattern that could lull even the most active mind into stillness. For a few moments, Hermes actually considered trying to nap again. The leather strip slipped from his fingers. His eyes grew heavy. But then, as if sensing his brief surrender to rest, his mind rebelled. A thought flickered through the drowsiness. Hadn't he seen a particularly interesting creek down the mountainside yesterday? One with smooth stones, perfect for skipping. And wasn't there that meadow nearby where the nymphs sometimes gathered in the afternoon to gossip and braid flowers into their hair? The thought of cool water and pretty nymphs was enough. Hermes rose to his feet in one fluid motion, the sudden movement making his mother glance up from her weaving. "Going somewhere?" she asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. "Just for a walk," Hermes said innocently. "Fresh air. Stretching my legs. Very responsible and not at all likely to result in complaints from other gods." Maha's expression suggested she had heard similar assurances before, usually right before Apollo came storming up the mountain, demanding the return of his sacred cattle. But she simply shook her head and returned to her weaving. "Try to be back before dark." "It's always am," Hermes called over his shoulder, already heading for the entrance. This was technically true. He was always back by dark. What happened between now and then? Well, that was the interesting part. The sunlight hit him like a warm wave as he stepped out of the cave. For a moment, he stood, blinking, his divine eyes adjusting to the brightness. The world outside shimmered with heat. The air itself seemed visible, wavering and thick, distorting the distant landscape into something dreamlike. Below him, the slopes of Mount Selene descended in waves of green and gold pine forests, giving way to scrubby meadows. Rocky outcrops punctuated by clusters of wildflowers that somehow thrived despite the sun's assault. The path down was well-worn from his countless expeditions. A thin line of pale dirt winding between boulders and olive trees, Hermes started walking, but slowly. Even a god had to respect the afternoon heat. There was no rush, after all. The creek wasn't going anywhere, and if the nymphs had already retreated to their grottos to escape the sun, well, he'd find something else to occupy his time. The cicada's drone was louder out here, a wall of sound that seemed to emanate from every tree simultaneously. It was a soundtrack of summer afternoons in Greece, that eternal insect chorus that made you feel like time had stopped altogether. Hermes found it oddly comforting. The world might be full of drama and danger, but the cicadas didn't care. They just sang and sang and sang. He passed a stunted olive tree that marked the boundary of the cave's immediate vicinity. Beyond it, the path forked left toward the valleys where mortals tended their flocks. Right toward the wilder parts of the mountain where nature still ruled undisturbed. Hermes took the right path without thinking. Wildness called to him more than civilization ever could. The ground here was rocky and uneven, scattered with loose stones that shifted under his bare feet. Hermes barely noticed. Gods didn't have to worry about stubbed toes or turned ankles the way mortals did. His feet were tough, divinely resilient, capable of walking across hot coals or sharp rocks without complaint. Still, he found himself looking down at them as he walked. His feet, while immortal, were unremarkable in appearance. Not particularly large or small, well-formed, but not remarkable. They served their purpose. They carried him wherever curiosity led. But they were completely exposed to the elements. Most gods went barefoot, of course. It was tradition. Divine feet touching the earth directly, maintaining that connection to Gaia herself. But recently, Hermes had been noticing that mortals were starting to wrap their feet in various waistcloths tied with string, crude leather wrappings held in place with knots. He'd seen a few shepherds experimenting with these contraptions, though most still went barefoot like their divine betters. Why did mortals do that? Protection, presumably. Their feet weren't as tough as divine ones. They got cut, bruised, burned by hot sand, or frozen by winter snow. Hermes understood the practical reasons. But there was something else, too something, about the way those foot trappings looked. Almost decorative, almost interesting. The thought drifted away as quickly as it had come. Hermes was easily distracted, his mind constantly jumping from one idea to the next, like a butterfly sampling flowers. Ahead, he could hear the faint trickle of water, the creek he'd been aiming for. The sound drew him forward. The path descended more steeply here, cutting between two large boulders that created a natural gateway. Beyond them, a small meadow opened up, surprisingly lush despite the season. A spring fed a tiny creek that bubbled up from between rocks and wandered across the grass before disappearing back. Underground 100 paces away, the grass around it was impossibly green, almost luminescent in the harsh sunlight. And there, lounging in the shade of a massive oak tree, were 3 nymphs just, as Hermes had hoped. They hadn't noticed him yet. 2 were half asleep, sprawled on the grass with flowers still woven into their hair from some earlier activity. The 3rd was trailing her fingers in the creek, creating lazy ripples that caught the light. Their skin seemed to glow with that subtle luminescence that marked them as something more than mortal. Though less than fully divine, Hermes considered announcing himself, perhaps with a witty greeting or a clever bit of wordplay. But something stopped him. The scene was so peaceful, so perfectly still, that interrupting it felt almost wrong, like walking into a painting or disturbing a carefully balanced sculpture. Instead, he settled quietly onto a sun-warmed rock at the meadow's edge, content to simply watch and listen. The creek babbled its endless conversation. A bee worked methodically through a patch of wild thyme. The nymphs breathed slowly, deeply, lost in whatever dreams visited them in the afternoon heat. This, Hermes thought, was what true peace looked like. Not the absence of things happening, but the presence of things happening so slowly, so naturally that they became almost invisible. The world turning at its own patient pace, unhurried by ambition or urgency. His hands, however, had different ideas about peace. They'd found a small stick near the rock and were already stripping its bark, shaping it, testing its flexibility. His fingers never stopped moving, never settled into true stillness. Even now, watching nymphs sleep beside a drowsy creek, some part of him was tinkering, inventing, preparing. The afternoon air hung heavy and sweet. Time seemed to pool here like water in a depression, gathering and deepening until each moment felt infinite. Hermes' eyes grew heavy again. Maybe he thought he could nap after all? Just for a few minutes. Just until the shadows grew a little longer. But his hands kept moving, kept shaping the stick, kept seeking something his mind hadn't quite identified yet. And in that space between sleep and waking, between conscious thought and idle motion, something was beginning to take shape, though what it was, even the god of invention couldn't yet say. Time passed in that peculiar way. It does on summer afternoons, both crawling and racing simultaneously, each moment stretching like honey, while somehow the sun kept moving across the sky. Hermes had slipped into a half-doze, his back against the warm rock. The stripped stick still clutched loosely in his fingers. A sound woke him. Not a dramatic sound, not a crack of thunder or a cry of alarm, but something much smaller. The dry scrape of shell against stone. Hermes' eyes opened lazily. For a moment he didn't move, just tracked the source of the sound with his divine vision. There, making its patient way across the sun-baked rocks at the meadow's edge, was a tortoise. Now, Hermes had a history with tortoises. The last one he'd encountered had ended up becoming the first Lyra. Transformation the tortoise probably hadn't anticipated when it woke up that morning. But this tortoise seemed blissfully unaware of its predecessor's fate. It simply plodded along, one deliberate step after another. Its ancient face set in that expression of cosmic patience that only tortoises seem to master. Hermes sat up slowly, watching the creature with renewed interest. The nymphs still slept, undisturbed. The creek still burbled its endless song. But now there was something new to focus on. A small puzzle to occupy his restless mind. The tortoise's shell was a magnificent dome of geometric perfection, each scale catching the light differently, creating a subtle pattern of golds and browns and deep umbers. It was a mobile home, a fortress, a work of art all in one. The tortoise carried it effortlessly, unburdened by its weight. Seemingly content with the slow pace its armor required. What would it be like, Hermes wondered idly, to wear such a thing? To carry your shelter wherever you went? The thought was absurd, of course. The shell was part of the tortoise, as integral as his own bones. You couldn't just wear it like... His mind snagged on something. Like what? Like clothing. Gods didn't typically wear mucha chitin or peplus when formality demanded it. But otherwise, divine bodies were meant to be displayed, not hidden. Yet mortals were always wrapping themselves in things. Cloaks against the cold, hats against the sun, and those foot trappings again. That curious innovation he'd been noticing more and more lately. The tortoise reached a patch of wild clover and began methodically eating, unconcerned with the god watching it. Each bite was deliberate, considered, as if the tortoise had all the time in the world. Given their legendary lifespans, it probably did. Hermes found himself smiling. There was something inherently funny about tortoises. Not laugh out loud funny, but smile to yourself funny. The way they moved with such determination despite their lack of speed. The way they retreated into their shells at the first sign of danger. As if hiding could fool anyone when you were obviously a tortoise-shaped lump on the ground. "I'm not going to turn you into a musical instrument," Hermes informed the creature solemnly. "That trick only works once. After that, it's just cruel." The tortoise, unsurprisingly, didn't respond. It finished its clover and began moving again, angling toward a patch of shade beneath a nearby shrub. Hermes watched it go, his fingers still absently working the stick he'd been shaping earlier. He'd stripped away all the bark now, leaving smooth white wood that felt pleasant under his touch. Without quite meaning to, he'd been carving it nothing elaborate, just smoothing it, finding its natural shape. The way a sculptor might rough out a form from marble, before committing to specific details. His other hand found another stick, then another. Soon, he had 3 or 4 pieces of wood in various stages of shaping. All worked on simultaneously, without any clear plan or purpose. This was how he thought best, not in straight lines from problem to solution, but in spirals and tangents. His hands exploring possibilities while his mind wandered elsewhere. The tortoise had reached its shade and settled down, tucking its legs under its shell with an air of finality. Nap time, apparently. Hermes could respect that. The whole world seemed to be napping, except for him. He glanced around the meadow again. The nymphs hadn't stirred. The sun had shifted slightly, creating new patterns of light and shadow across the grass. A lizard had emerged from somewhere and was doing push-ups on a flat stone. That curious reptilian exercise that seemed to serve no purpose, except perhaps to prove the lizard existed. Everything was moving at nature's pace, which is to say, it's barely moving at all. And yet, paradoxically, everything was in motion. The creek flowed. The breeze stirred. The sun crept westward. Even the sleeping nymphs breathed, their chests rising and falling in a rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse of the earth itself. Hermes set down his carved sticks and stretched, feeling his spine pop pleasantly. His divine body didn't really need to stretch. It was always at peak physical perfection, but the motion felt good anyway. Like scratching an itch that wasn't quite there, his eyes fell on the pile of materials. He'd unconsciously gathered several sticks, some long grasses he'd pulled while walking, a few strips of bark. He'd been collecting without realizing it. His hands operating independently of his conscious mind, gathering raw materials for some project his creativity hadn't quite identified yet. This was the part he loved most, the moment before knowing. When potential hung in the air like morning mist, full of shapes that might become anything. He could make something from these materials. But what? A whistle? A toy? Some new instrument to rival the lyre? His gaze drifted back to his feet. Bare. Dusty. Perfectly functional, but undeniably exposed. The thought from earlier returned, more insistent now. Those foot trappings the mortals were experimenting with. What were they really for? Just protection? Or was there something more? Hermes wiggled his toes, studying them with uncharacteristic focus. Feet were odd, really. 10 toes of varying lengths, arches that flexed and flattened, heels that bore weight and propelled movement forward. Remarkable pieces of engineering when you thought about it, but also vulnerable. All those bones so close to the surface, all that delicate mechanics exposed to whatever the ground might throw at you. Not that he worried about injury. Divine feet healed instantly from anything short of a titan's curse. But mortals. They had to be more careful. Every step was a small risk. Negotiation between their soft flesh and the hard world. Maybe that was why they wrapped their feet. Not just protection, but confidence. The confidence to walk without watching every step, to move boldly across uncertain terrain, to travel further and faster without worry. An interesting thought. Hermes filed it away in the vast, chaotic library of his mind, where it joined thousands of other interesting thoughts waiting for the right moment to become useful. The lizard had finished its push-ups, was now sunbathing with an expression of deep satisfaction. The tortoise snoozed in its shell. The nymphs dreamed their slow dreams. And Hermes sat with his pile of sticks and grass and bark, his hands beginning to move again. Not quite knowing what they were building, but trusting that they'd figure it out eventually, because that was how creation worked. Not top-down from grand vision to careful execution, but bottom-up, from idle experiment to accidental discovery. You played until something interesting emerged. You tinkered until the materials told you what they wanted to be. And on this drowsy afternoon, with the whole world barely moving around him, Hermes' hands were beginning to speak a language his mind didn't quite understand yet. But they would. Oh, they would. The afternoon was only half over, after all. And accidents, as any inventor knows, take time to develop. Eventually, the meadow grew to warm, even for a god's comfort. The sun, that relentless Helios driving his chariot overhead, had shifted angles, and now the rock where Hermes sat was fully exposed to its glare. Even the shade beneath the oak tree looked meager and uninviting. The nymphs had vanished at some point, slipped away to their grottos with that peculiar silence nymphs possessed. Leaving no trace except slightly crushed grass where they'd been lying, Hermes gathered his collection of sticks and stood. "You're stretching again." The tortoise was still there, a patient dome of shell tucked under its shrub, committed to remaining motionless until evening brought cooler air. Hermes envied it briefly, such contentment in stillness, such peace in simply being rather than doing. But stillness didn't suit him, never had. His nature was movement, change, transition. He was the god of boundaries and crossings, of messages delivered and journeys begun. Sitting still felt like fighting against his own divine essence, so he began the walk back up to the cave, taking his time, letting his mind wander as aimlessly as his feet. The path seemed longer going up than it had coming down, the way return journeys always do. The heat pressed against him like a physical presence. Sweat would have beaded on a mortal's brow, but gods didn't sweat the same way. They simply felt the discomfort without the body's mechanisms to cope with it, which was in some ways worse. By the time he reached the cave entrance, Hermes was ready for the cool darkness. He ducked inside with relief, his eyes adjusting instantly to the dimness. Maya was no longer at her loom. She'd left it standing with the shuttle resting in mid-pattern, gone somewhere deeper into the mountain, probably to the spring that fed their water supply. Or perhaps to visit with other nymphs in the vast cavern system that honeycombed Selene's interior. The cave felt emptier without her presence, but also more permissive. No maternal gaze to observe his tinkering, no gentle questions about what he was making or why. Just Hermes and his restless hands and the pile of materials he'd collected, plus whatever else was lying around from previous projects. He settled onto his favorite spot, a flat area, near the entrance where the light still reached but the heat didn't follow. Around him, the detritus of weeks or months of casual invention, carved wood pieces of unknown purpose. Woven grass that had been the beginning of a basket before he'd lost interest. Clay that he'd shaped into various forms and then abandoned. And yes, there it was, a substantial pile of goat hide scraps. The leather had been left over from various projects. Some from repairing bags and sandals. Maya wore sandals already. Simple things of the old style that were barely more than soles with basic straps. Some from crafting the drumhead for an experimental instrument that hadn't quite worked out. Some from gods knew what. Projects started and forgotten so long ago that even his divine memory couldn't place them. Hermes picked up one of the larger pieces, turning it over in his hands. The leather was beautiful in its own way, the subtle variations in color and texture. The supple strength that came from proper tanning. The faint smell of the olive oil and beeswax that preserved it. Someone, probably Maya, had done good work preparing these hides, The leather was still pliable despite sitting here for who knew how long. The oils kept it from drying out, kept it ready for use whenever use might be needed. It felt alive in a way, responsive to his touch, ready to be shaped into. Something what, though? Hermes laid the piece across his lap and reached for one of the sticks he'd brought back from the meadow. His hands began to move without conscious direction, cutting small slits in the leather with a sharp stone, threading grass through the holes, testing how different materials combined. No plan, no blueprint. Just experimentation, the pure play of seeing what worked and what didn't. This was his favorite state, the flow of creation. When time seemed to stop and thought merged with action, when his hands knew things his mind hadn't learned yet. Hours could pass in this state, tore minutes that felt like hours. Gods experience time differently than mortals, and creative gods most differently of all. He cut another strip of leather, this one long and thin, then another. His fingers braided them together, creating a rope of leather stronger than any single strand. Interesting, but not quite right for whatever this was becoming. He unknotted the braid and tried a different approach, leaving the strips separate but weaving them into a loose grid pattern. Better, more flexible, but still not quite. Hermes paused, studying his work. The leather strips lay across his lap in a vaguely geometric pattern, interlocking at odd angles. It looked like nothing so much as a very loose net, though sized for catching something much smaller than fish. A net for catching thoughts, maybe, or dreams. He smiled at his own fancy and kept working. The cave grew dimmer as the afternoon wore on, the angle of light shifting gradually as Helios continued his patient journey across the sky. Hermes barely noticed. His world had contracted to the space immediately around his hands, leather and string and stone tools. The texture of materials against his fingers, the small sounds of cutting and threading and tying, more pieces joined the collection. He was cutting them to different lengths now, though he couldn't have said why. Some as long as his forearm, others barely longer than his thumb. His divine hands moved with speed and precision that would have seemed magical to mortal eyes, but was simply normal for him. The baseline of what his nature allowed, the pile of prepared leather strips grew. Hermes set aside the one he'd been working into a grid and started another, this time trying a different pattern entirely. Not a grid, but something else, a different kind of structure. Strips radiating from a central point like sun rays, connected by cross pieces that... No, that wasn't it either. He abandoned that attempt and grabbed more leather. What was he making? He still didn't know. His hands knew, or thought they knew, but they weren't sharing that knowledge with his conscious mind yet. So he kept going on faith of faith, every inventor must have that the process itself will eventually reveal its destination. Outside, birds called to each other in the pre-evening chorus, that subtle shift in bird conversation that marked the transition from day's heat to evening's relief. The cicadas' drone was diminishing, their day shift ending. Soon, the night singers would take over crickets and frogs and night birds with their own languages. But inside the cave, only one sound mattered. The soft whisper of leather against leather, the faint scrape of stone against hide, the subtle music of creation that had no audience except its creator. Hermes picked up a particularly nice piece of leather, soft but strong, tanned to perfection, just the right thickness. He laid it flat on the ground and placed his foot on it, studying the contrast of divine flesh against worked hide. His foot looked oddly vulnerable there, pale against the darker leather. All those delicate bones and tendons visible beneath, skin that was tougher than steel, but looked fragile as a mortal child's. What if? The thought came unbidden, unexpected. What if you wrapped leather around a foot? Not like mortals had been doing, with crude strips tied randomly, but properly, designed, intentional. Hermes left his foot where it was and began laying leather strips across it, experimenting with arrangements. One strip across the toes, another over the arch, a longer piece wrapping around the heel. His hands moved faster now, sensing they were close to something, though what remained elusive. The strips needed to be held in place. That was obvious. But how? Tied with string? That would work, but seemed inelegant. There should be a better way, something that used the leather itself. That turned the whole arrangement into a unified piece rather than separate components. Held together by force, he tried interlocking the strips, weaving them through each other. Better, much better. Now they supported each other, distributed tension across the whole structure. When he pulled one strip tight, the others adjusted automatically. Finding their own balance, Hermes removed his foot and studied what he'd created. It looked like a mess, honestly. A tangle of leather strips that held a vaguely foot-shaped space in their center, but there was something there, some kernel of usefulness buried in the chaos. He tried it again, starting over with fresh leather, applying what he'd learned from the first attempt. This time, he planned the strips before cutting them one long piece that would wrap around the foot's perimeter. Shorter pieces to crisscross the top, something that would grip the heel. His hands flew through the work, cutting and arranging, testing and adjusting. The pile of leather scraps around him grew as failed attempts were discarded. But each failure taught him something, refined his understanding, brought him closer to whatever his hands were trying to build. The light was fading now, the cave filling with that soft gloom that comes just before true darkness. Somewhere in the back chambers, Maya had returned and was moving about, preparing the evening meal by the sound of pottery clinks and liquid pouring. The smell of olive oil and herbs drifted forward, but Hermes didn't look up. Couldn't look up. Because his hands had just done something interesting, had just stumbled onto an arrangement of leather strips that felt right. He stared down at the construction in his lap, trying to understand what his hands had known all along. It was a platform of thicker leather with strips emerging from it at strategic points. Strips that could wrap around and over and under a foot, creating a kind of... what? A foot holder. A foot trapper. Well, there wasn't a word for it yet, because it had never existed before, and in the fading light of a Mediterranean afternoon. In a cave halfway up Mount Selene, young Hermes smiled slowly as understanding finally caught up with invention. His hands, those restless divine instruments of creation, had just stumbled onto something entirely new. Something that was going to change how the expert world walked, though he didn't quite realize that yet. All he knew was that his boredom had finally, beautifully, transformed into discovery, and the afternoon, against all odds, had become interesting after all. The construction in Hermes' lap had evolved past the stage of interesting experiment into something that demanded to be tested. That was the next logical step. Always test your creations. See if they worked in practice as well as in theory. Or in this case, see if they worked at all, since there was no theory. Only accidental discovery. He held up his invention to the failing light, studying it from different angles. The main piece was an oval of thicker leather, roughly the length and width of his foot. From its edges emerged several strips, each carefully positioned, two at the toes, two at the midfoot, one at the heel, and a longer piece that could wrap around the ankle. The strips themselves had holes punched in them at intervals, allowing them to be threaded through each other in various configurations. It looked, Hermes had to admit, completely ridiculous, like a leather octopus, or a piece of harness that had come undone, or abstract art from some future century that wouldn't appreciate it anyway. But there was logic to it. Even if that logic had arrived backward, building itself up from accident rather than descending from plan. Each strip served a purpose, holding the foot in place, distributing pressure, keeping the leather platform attached to skin. Together, they created something. That was more than the sum of its parts. Only one way to find out if it actually worked. Hermes set the leather construction on the ground and placed his foot carefully onto the thicker base piece. The leather was cool against his sole, smooth and pleasant. So far, so good. He picked up one of the toe strips and pulled it over his foot, threading it through a hole in the strip from the other side. A simple basket weave pattern emerged, crisscrossing over his toes and holding them gently in place. Not uncomfortable. Not uncomfortable at all, actually. Unusual, but not unpleasant. Encouraged, he continued. The midfoot strips came next, wrapping around the sides and meeting over the top of his arch. He wove these through each other, creating an X pattern that tightened when he pulled, but didn't cut into his skin. The leather distributed the pressure across a wider area, spreading what could have been painful tension into something merely snug. The heel strip was trickier. He had to reach around behind his foot, fumbling a bit, adjusting the length. Too short, and it wouldn't hold. Too long, and the whole thing would slide around. After a few attempts, he found the right balance point. Threading the strip through a loop near the ankle and pulling it snug, finally, the long ankle strap. This wrapped around once, twice, creating a secure attachment that seemed to lock everything else into place. When Hermes tied it off a simple knot, nothing fancy, the entire construction suddenly unified. What had been separate strips became a single, coherent piece. A leather framework that held his foot securely, while still allowing full range of motion. He wiggled his toes. They moved freely, unencumbered. He flexed his ankle. The whole construction moved with him, flexing where it needed to flex, holding firm where support was required. He pressed down. Testing how weight felt distributed across the leather sole. Different. Definitely different from barefoot walking. Not better or worse exactly, just other. The ground felt distant, mediated through the leather barrier. But that barrier also meant his foot wasn't directly contacting the cold stone of the cave floor. Wasn't feeling every pebble and ridge and variation in texture. Hermes stood carefully, keeping his weight on his unshod foot, while the shod one hovered just above the ground, not quite trusting his creation yet. The leather construction stayed in place, all the strips maintaining their positions, the knots holding firm. It looked absurd, one bare foot, one swaddled in an octopus of leather strips, but it felt stable. He lowered the shod foot slowly, transferring weight onto it. The leather sole compressed slightly under his weight, conforming to the stone floor. The strips tightened fractionally, automatic adjustments that kept everything aligned, and his foot stayed put inside its leather framework, secure and supported. And most surprising comfortable. Hermes took a step. The sound was different. Not the soft pad of barefoot on stone, but a gentle slap as the leather sole made contact with the floor. Slap was quieter than a full footfall, but more substantial than bare skin. Hermes felt a flicker of defensiveness. He'd invented this thing mere hours ago, and already she was critiquing the execution. But Maha's tone wasn't critical, it was practical. The voice of experience improving on raw innovation. She slipped her own foot into the construction, working it around until it sat properly. Her foot was smaller than his, so the fit wasn't perfect, but close enough. She tied the straps with practiced efficiency, adjusting tensions with the instinctive knowledge of someone who'd tied thousands of things over her long existence. Then she stood and took a few steps around the cave. Slap, slap, slap. The sound was different from when Hermes wore it, lighter, quicker, a slightly higher pitch. The sound of a different foot, a different gait, a different relationship with the ground. Comfortable, Maya announced after a circuit of the main chamber. Odd, but comfortable. In practical, I can feel the stones on the floor, but they don't press into my soul. She walked to the cave entrance and tested it on the dirt path beyond, then returned. Very practical. Mortals would love these. Mortals? Their feet aren't like ours. They need protection, cushioning, support. This provides all three. She began untying the straps. You should show this to some of the shepherds. See if they can use it. I wasn't planning to share it, Hermes protested. It was just a way to pass the afternoon. Maya handed back the foot covering with a knowing look. When have you ever made something without showing it off? You invented the lyre and immediately challenged Apollo to a musical contest. You're not the shy type, my son. She had a point. Hermes loved attention, loved recognition, loved the moment when others realized he'd done something clever. But this felt different somehow. The lyre had been obviously brilliant music itself, pulled from a tortoise shell and some sheep gut. Everyone could understand the magnitude of that invention instantly. But this was just leather strips wrapped around feet. Practical, yes, but hardly glamorous. Would anyone even care? He slipped the construction back onto his foot, retying the straps, settling it into place. The leather had warmed from Maya's body heat, making it feel even more comfortable now, almost like a second skin. A very thick, very flexible second skin that made soft slapping sounds when he walked after dinner. Hermes wandered outside despite the darkness. The sun had set while they ate. Now the stars were emerging in their countless thousands. That scatter of distant lights that was so dense here in the mountains, away from any mortal fires. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of luminescence. Hermes could name every constellation, knew every story attached to their patterns. But tonight he wasn't looking up. He was looking down at the path before his feet. Testing his invention on different surfaces in the darkness. Packed earth, good grip, comfortable, slight cushioning. Scattered gravel, better than barefoot the leather, prevented sharp stones from digging in. Smooth rock, slippery when dust covered it, but manageable with careful steps. Grass felt almost like barefoot. The leather thin enough to sense the texture, thick enough to prevent scratching from rough stems. Each surface taught him something about what he'd made. The leather acted as an interface between foot and world, translating sensations while adding its own character to the experience. Walking had become mediated, interpreted, changed. Hermes found himself wandering further from the cave than he'd intended, his feet carrying him down the path toward the lower slopes. The night was warm, almost uncomfortably so, the day's heat still radiating from stone and soil. Crickets sang their endless songs. Something rustled in the underbrush, some small nocturnal creature going about its business. And with each step, the soft slap of leather on earth. A new sound in the ancient night. The percussion of innovation. He thought about what Maya had said. Mortals would love these. Would they, though? Mortals were practical people, concerned with survival and work and family. They didn't have time for experimentation and novelty. If they'd been getting along fine with bare feet or crude foot trappings for centuries, why would they care about his leather contraption? But then again, hadn't they been getting along fine with drums and singing before he invented the lyre? And yet once music existed, suddenly everyone wanted it. Suddenly something that seemed unnecessary became essential. Maybe that was the pattern. Maybe necessity wasn't the mother of invention after all. Maybe invention was the mother of necessity, creating desires people didn't know they had. Solving problems they hadn't realized existed. Heavy thoughts for a midnight walk. Hermes shook them off and focused on the physical sensations instead. The leather was beginning to feel like part of his feet now, that initial strangeness fading into familiarity. He could walk without thinking about it, which was the ultimate test of any tool. When it disappeared into the background, becoming transparent. An extension of the body rather than an obstacle to it. A sound ahead made him pause. Voices, mortal voices, speaking in the low tones people use when they don't want to disturb the night. Hermes smiled. Perfect timing. Hadn't Maya suggested showing his invention to some shepherds? Well, here were some shepherds. And though it was the middle of the night, when had timing ever stopped him from showing off? He adjusted his course toward the voices, his leather-clad feet making soft noises on the path that were just loud enough to announce his presence without seeming threatening. In the distance, a fire glowed orange a shepherd's camp. Exactly as he'd expected, time to introduce the world to something new, though he suspected the introduction would go about as well as most of his interactions with mortals. Confusing, mildly concerning, and ultimately more entertaining for him than for them. But that was half the fun of being the god of mischief and invention. The other half was the look on their faces when they tried to figure out what exactly was wrapped around his feet. The shepherd's camp was modest, a small fire ringed with stones. A few sheep huddled together in the darkness beyond the light's reach. Two men sitting on logs drawn close to the flames. The firelight painted their faces in warm tones, highlighting the weathered features that came from spending life outdoors under the Mediterranean sun. They were older men, possibly brothers from their similar builds, with that patient stillness that shepherds develop after years of watching flocks that don't do much except eat and occasionally wander. They looked up as Hermes approached, their conversation dying mid-sentence. There was no alarm in their expressions, just mild curiosity, and the resignation of men who've learned that strange things happen in the mountains at night and getting excited about them is a waste of energy, evening, one of them said, his voice gravelly with age and possibly too much wine. The cup in his hand supported the wine theory. Evening, Hermes replied cheerfully. He settled onto a rock near the fire without waiting for an invitation, which was either divine privilege or just rudeness, depending on your perspective. Mind if I warm up? Free fire, the other shepherd said with a shrug. His eyes were already closing again, head nodding forward in that way of someone who'd been dozing before the interruption and was eager to return to it. You lost? Just wandering, Hermes said, which was true enough. Couldn't sleep. The first shepherd took a sip of his wine, studying Hermes with the practiced assessment of someone who's seen plenty of travelers. You're not dressed for wandering. Hermes glanced down at himself. He was wearing his typical chiton, simple and comfortable, exactly what any young man might wear. I'm dressed fine. Your feet, the shepherd clarified, gesturing with his cup. What have you got on your feet? And there it was, the opening he'd been waiting for. Hermes extended one foot toward the firelight, displaying his creation. The leather straps gleamed where the oil had been absorbed. The whole construction looking both primitive and sophisticated simultaneously. In the flickering light, the shadows between the straps seemed to move, making the pattern more complex than it actually was. Both shepherds leaned forward slightly, squinting. The second one had stopped dozing. His interest peaked despite his obvious desire to sleep. Foot coverings, Hermes said simply. You can see that? The first shepherd replied. Question is why? Your feet broken? No, they work fine. These just make walking more comfortable. The shepherds exchanged glances, that silent communication of people who've known each other so long they don't need words. Then the first one said, How? It was a fair question. Hermes considered how to explain something that had never existed before to people who'd never imagined needing it. They protect your feet from sharp stones and hot sand. They cushion your steps so you can walk longer without getting tired. They keep your soles from getting cut or burned. Your feet divine? The second shepherd asked, fully awake now? Maybe, Hermes said evasively. No point in confirming his godhood. Outright mortals got weird when they knew they were talking to deities. All formal and nervous. Better to keep things casual, because, the shepherd continued, divine feet don't need protecting. So either you're mortal, or those foot things are for mortals. Clever. Hermes liked this shepherd. The second one, he admitted. I made them, but mortals could use them. You selling? The first shepherd asked, suddenly more alert. Entrepreneurship was universal, apparently. No, I'm just showing them. Seeing what people think. I think they look strange, the shepherd said bluntly. Like you tied a bunch of strips around your feet for no reason, but are they useful? How should I know? I'm not wearing them. Another fair point. Hermes considered, then began untying the ankle strap. Want to try? The shepherd looked suddenly wary, as if suspecting a trick. Try what? The foot covering. See if it works for you. Why would I do that? Curiosity, Hermes suggested. It's the middle of the night. You're half asleep anyway. I'm offering you something that's never existed before. Doesn't that interest you even a little? The two shepherds exchanged glances again. Then the first one shrugged and extended his foot. Fine. Can't hurt to try, I suppose. If you're some spirit playing tricks, you've picked a strange way to do it. Hermes grinned and finished removing the leather construction from his own foot. The shepherd's foot was larger than his, broader and more calloused. The sole thick with the evidence of decades of barefoot walking. The nails were cracked and yellowed. The skin looked tough as cured hide. This was a foot that had never known comfort, only functionality. The leather construction didn't fit perfectly. Hermes had to adjust the straps, threading them through different holes to accommodate the broader dimensions. But the basic design was flexible enough to adapt. Soon enough, the shepherd's foot was wrapped in leather, the straps crisscrossing in that same pattern Hermes had stumbled onto that afternoon. The shepherd stared down at his shod foot, its expression unreadable. Then he stood slowly, carefully, like a man testing ice that might break under him. He took a tentative step, then another. The sound was the same as when Hermes wore it, that soft slap of leather on earth, that new percussion added to the night symphony. Well, Hermes asked, unable to hide his eagerness. The shepherd didn't answer immediately. He walked a circuit around the fire, testing the construction on different surfaces: dirt, grass, a patch of gravel. His gait was measured, deliberate. The walk of someone paying attention to every sensation. Finally, he stopped and looked down at his foot again. "Huh," he said. "Huh. Good or bad?" "Just huh." The shepherd flexed his foot, making the leather creak. "Feels strange." "Not bad strange, just different. Like my foot's wrapped up in something." "But is it comfortable?" "Suppose so. Can't feel the gravel as much. Stones don't dig in like normal, so it works." "For what?" The shepherd looked up, his eyes sharp despite the hour in the wine. "What's it for? If my feet are tough enough to walk anywhere I need to go, why cover them?" Hermes opened his mouth, then closed it. Another fair question, and one he didn't have a great answer for. What if you could walk farther? He tried. Walk longer without your feet getting tired. Go places you'd normally avoid because the ground's too rough. I already go everywhere I need to. But what if you need to go somewhere new? Why would I do that? My sheep are here. Logical. Annoyingly logical. Hermes tried a different approach. What about in winter? When the ground's cold and frozen, wrap my feet in cloth like always. These are better than cloth. Maybe. The shepherd began untying the straps, working them loose with the patient determination of someone who tied and untied a million knots in his lifetime. Seems like a lot of effort for something that solves a problem I don't have. He handed the leather construction back to Hermes, who accepted it with a mix of disappointment and respect. You couldn't argue with that kind of practical assessment. The shepherd was right if you didn't see the problem. The solution was just unnecessary complexity. But the second shepherd, who'd been watching silently, spoke up. Could be useful for traveling, though. Merchants and such. People who walk long distances on roads. Maybe the first shepherd conceded. He settled back onto his log and reclaimed his wine cup. Seems like more trouble than it's worth for us, though. Hermes retied the construction onto his own foot, processing the feedback. Not the enthusiastic reception he'd half hoped for, but not complete rejection either. Just practical assessment from practical men who saw no immediate need for innovation. You gonna make more of those? The second shepherd asked, his eyes already closing again. Maybe, Hermes said. Still figuring out what they're for? Well, good luck with that. Just like that, the conversation was over. The shepherds returned to their drowsy vigil, the fire crackling between them, sheep making occasional sounds in the darkness. Hermes sat for a few more minutes, warming his hands at the flames, thinking about utility and necessity, and whether inventions needed to solve existing problems, or could create new possibilities. The first drops of new understanding were beginning to form. Even if he couldn't articulate them yet, maybe his foot coverings weren't for everyone. Maybe they were for specific people, with specific needs: travelers, merchants, soldiers. Anyone whose feet were their primary tools of locomotion and who needed those tools to work better, longer, more reliably. Or maybe they were just an interesting idea that would fade into obscurity. One more experiment in a lifetime of experiments. Either way, the night was still young, and his feet were still comfortable in their leather frameworks, and there was something satisfying about having made something that at least worked. Even if its purpose remained unclear, Hermes stood and bid the shepherds good night, though they were already dozing again and probably didn't hear him. He headed back up the path toward the cave, his footsteps marking a new rhythm in the ancient night. The soft slap of leather on earth. The sound of something new entering an old world. The percussion of change so subtle, it might take generations to be fully heard. But it was heard. Oh, it was heard, even if nobody quite realized it yet. News traveled strangely on Olympus. Sometimes it arrived with fanfare heralds announcing great deeds. Messengers breathlessly delivering urgent updates, proclamations shouted from the heights. Other times it drifted in like morning mist, spreading through whispered conversations and casual observations until everyone somehow knew something without anyone having officially announced it. Hermes' latest invention belonged to the second category. It began as these things often do, with a minor deity noticing something odd. In this case, it was one of the Horitha, goddesses of the seasons who'd been visiting Mount Selene on unrelated business and had spotted Hermes walking near the cave wearing what appeared to be leather restraints on his feet. Curious, odd, mildly concerning. Given Hermes' history of questionable decisions, she mentioned it to her sisters. They mentioned it to some nymphs. The nymphs told the river gods. The river gods gossiped with passing travelers, who carried the news to their own divine circles, and so on, until the information had percolated through the entire supernatural infrastructure in that way. Information does when it's interesting but not important. Eventually, inevitably, it reached Olympus proper. Zeus first heard about it during the midday meal. That relaxed gathering when the Olympians came together to eat and gossip and complain about their various responsibilities. The Great Hall was less crowded than during formal occasions, just the major deities and a handful of attendants. The atmosphere was casual, almost domestic, with gods sprawled on couches and reaching across each other for dishes of ambrosia and cups of nectar. "Have you heard about Hermes?" Hera asked, not to Zeus specifically, but to the table at large. She was lounging on her couch with the languid grace of someone who'd had exactly the right amount of nectar relaxed but not impaired. Zeus, who'd been half dozing with a cup balanced on his chest, cracked one eye open. What's he done now? Stolen more cattle? Nothing dramatic, Hera assured him. Just invented something odd. He's always inventing odd things, Athena pointed out from her position near the window. She'd been reading a scroll. She hadn't looked up, but her attention was clearly on the conversation. That's rather his function. Yes, but this is odd even for him, Hera continued. Apparently, he's wrapped his feet in leather. A pause. Then Zeus said, "Why?" "No idea. Is it some kind of punishment? Did he offend someone?" "Doesn't seem to be. He made it himself, voluntarily." Zeus processed this information with the speed of someone whose brain was still half asleep. So he made foot restraints and put them on. "For no reason?" "There's probably a reason," Athena interjected, finally looking up. "Hermes doesn't do things randomly. There's always some logic, even if it's logic only he understands initially." "Guys, what kind of logic leads to wrapping your feet in leather?" Apollo asked from his couch. He'd been tuning his lyre, the very lyre Hermes had invented. Ironically, but now his attention was caught. "Is it decorative?" "Ceremonial. Practical, supposedly," Hera said. "Something about making walking more comfortable," Apollo laughed. "His feet are divine. They're already perfectly comfortable." "That's what I thought," Hera agreed. "But apparently, he's suggesting mortals might use them." This sparked more interest. Zeus sat up slightly, his cup sloshing nectar onto his robes. He didn't notice. "Mortals? What do mortals need with foot leather things? Protection, perhaps?" Athena suggested. "Mortal feet are considerably more vulnerable than ours. They get injured, isilicas, burns, blisters. Something to shield them from harsh terrain might be genuinely useful. Mortals have been walking fine without shielding for millennia." Ares grumbled from the corner where he'd been sharpening a spear. He sounded annoyed, but then Ares always sounded annoyed. "Why do they suddenly need special foot coverings?" "Maybe they don't need them," Athena said thoughtfully. "Maybe it's an improvement rather than a necessity. Something that makes an existing function work better." Zeus yawned, suddenly losing interest now that the topic had turned philosophical. "Well, if it helps mortals walk better, I suppose that's fine. Can't hurt. Might even be useful for soldiers or messengers or whatnot." He waved a hand dismissively. "Approved, whatever. Someone tell Hermes his foot things are sanctioned." "Just like that?" Hera asked. "No inquiry into the design? No assessment of potential consequences?" "They're leather strips on feet," Zeus said, settling back down. "Not exactly world-changing. If it makes mortals happy and doesn't interfere with anything important, I don't see the harm." "Practical, actually," Hephaestus spoke up from near the hearth, where he'd been working on some metal craft. The smith god rarely contributed to these conversations unless they touched on his expertise. But apparently foot coverings qualified. I've been thinking about something similar for forge workers. The floor gets incredibly hot near the furnaces. Something between feet and ground would be useful. See, Zeus said to Hera. Even Hephaestus thinks it's practical. Motion carried. Hermes foot leather things are officially approved. Now, can someone pass the ambrosia? And just like that, divine sanction was granted. Not with ceremony or deliberation, but with the casual indifference of beings who'd seen countless innovations come and go over millennia. A few leather strips wrapped around feet didn't warrant serious attention. It was mildly interesting, potentially useful, and entirely harmless, which in retrospect was exactly the kind of assessment you made about things that ended up changing everything. The conversation drifted to other topics, disputes among mortals, scheduling for upcoming festivals, complaints about prayers that were too demanding. But in the quiet spaces between words, and the pauses and transitions, a new idea had been planted in divine consciousness. Foot coverings. Leather frameworks that mediated between flesh and earth. A tool that changed how one moved through the world. Apollo, who'd returned to tuning his lyre, found himself glancing down at his own bare feet. Perfect divine feet, beautifully formed, never injured or tired. They needed no improvement, and yet, what if they could be made somehow? Different? Not better exactly, but other. What if the experience of walking could be changed, varied, made into something more than just automatic locomotion? The thought was intriguing, distracting even. Apollo made a mental note to visit Mount Selene soon and see these foot coverings for himself. Not because he needed them, of course not. Just because Hermes' inventions were always worth examining. The lyre had transformed music. Perhaps these leather foot things would transform something else. Whatever it was, feet did besides walk. Athena, meanwhile, was already sketching designs in the margins of her scroll. Her mind worked faster than most, seeing implications and applications that others missed. Foot protection for soldiers, obvious. But what else? Better grip on different terrains? Support for injured or weak ankles? Weight distribution to prevent fatigue during long marches? The possibilities branched out like a tree, each application suggesting 3 more. This was how useful innovations worked. They started solving one problem and ended solving dozens you hadn't anticipated. The lyre had been meant to make music, but it had also created new forms of poetry, new ways of teaching, new social gatherings, centered around song. What would foot coverings create? She'd have to investigate further. Perhaps commission some mortal craftsmen to experiment with designs. See what they came up with when given the basic concept and left to innovate. Mortals were surprisingly clever when properly motivated. Hera, less interested in practical applications, was more concerned with appearances. Foot coverings could be decorative, she mused. Dyed leather, perhaps, or embroidered straps. If mortals were going to start wearing these things, they might as well look elegant doing it. She'd speak to some of the fashion-minded nymphs, get their input on aesthetics. Even Zeus, who'd dismissed the topic so quickly, found his thoughts returning to it as the afternoon wore on. The nectar made everything seem profound. Foot coverings, shoes. Did the English speakers of some far future call them shoes? The knowledge drifted through his divine omniscience like a half-remembered dream. Yes, shoes. Thousands of variations eventually. Entire industries. Cultural significance. All from Hermes being bored on a summer afternoon. Zeus smiled to himself. That was the thing about his children, they never did anything simple. Even their accidents had implications. The sun moved westward. The divine meal concluded. The Olympians drifted off to their various responsibilities and entertainments. But the seed had been planted, the idea introduced. Hermes' invention had been acknowledged, sanctioned, and most importantly accepted as potentially useful, which meant it would spread. Not immediately. Not dramatically, but inevitably, the way all good ideas spread, person to person, place to place, adaptation building on adaptation, until the original invention was both preserved and transformed. both remembered and forgotten, both exactly what Hermes made and nothing like it at all. But that was still to come. For now. It was just an interesting novelty, approved by divine authority in the most casual way possible. Ready to begin its slow journey from accident to necessity, the gods returned to their half-awake afternoon, comfortable and content. Having no idea they'd just witnessed the birth of something that would outlast even their own worship. But then, that's how the important moments usually go, quiet and unremarkable, barely noticed even by those who live them. There's something profound about footprints, if you stop to think about them, which most people don't, of course. We walk through life leaving marks behind us, in sand, in snow, in dust, in mud we barely notice. Our attention is forward, toward where we're going, not backward at where we've been. But the marks remain. Long after we've passed, our footprints testified to our presence. I was here. I walked this way. I existed, however briefly, in this specific place at this specific moment. Consider the beach. The tide comes in twice daily, erasing every footprint, every trace of passage, resetting the sand to its pristine state. And yet people keep walking there, keep making footprints that will vanish within hours. Why? Because the act of marking matters more than the mark's permanence. We walk to prove we can walk. We leave prints to prove we lived. Now imagine changing how those footprints are made. Not the foot itself. That's determined by birth, by genetics, by the body you're given. But the interface between foot and ground, that can be changed. That can be modified, enhanced, altered, to create different marks, different pressures, different relationships with the earth. This is what Hermes had done, though he hadn't quite realized it yet. By creating his leather foot coverings, he'd introduced a new kind of footprint into the world. Not the direct impression of bare sole, but something mediated. The print of leather, rather than flesh. A human trace that was slightly less human, slightly more tool. The philosopher Heraclitus would later say, or perhaps had already said, time was funny for gods that you couldn't step in the same river twice, because the river was constantly changing. But he should have added, you also couldn't step the same way twice. Because the stepping itself was always evolving, always finding new methods, new interfaces, new ways of making contact with the world, bare feet pressing directly into earth, the oldest method, the most intimate, the most vulnerable, wrapped feet. Protected by leather, a step removed, a layer between, a new relationship, and eventually in futures Hermes couldn't see, but that already existed in the strange divine knowledge that leaked backwards and forwards through time-even stranger footwear, boots, sandals, heels, sneakers. Each one changing not just how feet touched ground, but how people moved, how far they could go, what terrains they could navigate. Every innovation in footwear was also an innovation in freedom. The freedom to walk farther, faster, longer, safer. The freedom to cross deserts and mountains and frozen wastes that bare feet could never endure. The freedom to run without pain, to jump without injury, to dance without blisters. Hermes had accidentally begun something vast. But let's return to the footprints themselves. Because they matter in ways beyond philosophy. They tell stories. Hunters read footprints to track prey. Scouts read them to detect enemies. Parents read them to find wandering children. We read our own footprints to understand where we've been. How we've traveled, whether we were running or walking, confident or hesitant. And now there would be a new kind of footprint to read. The shod print. The covered foot, the mark of someone who'd adopted Hermes's innovation. You'd be able to tell, just by looking at the ground, who was walking protected and who was walking bare. A new form of information encoded in the dust. This might seem like a small thing. It might seem trivial, even silly, to spend time thinking about footprints and what they mean. But small things accumulate. Trivial changes compound. And eventually, the sum of many tiny innovations becomes something that transforms civilization itself. Consider, if you can walk farther, you can explore more territory. If you can explore more, You can find new resources, establish new settlements, encounter new peoples. If you can move faster and more safely, you can create longer trade routes, spreading goods and ideas across greater distances. If your feet are protected, you can walk as your primary form of transportation, rather than something you only do when necessary. All. Because of leather wrapped around feet, all. Because a young god was bored on a summer afternoon, the classical Greeks had a concept, muete kai alpha nuwe mechan, from which we get machine and mechanism. But the original meaning was broader. It meant any clever device. Any tool that extended human capability, any invention that changed how things worked. Hermes was the god of mechan, the patron of that specifically human drive to make tools that made life better, and what was more fundamentally tool-like than something that enhanced your very ability to move through the world. The sun was setting now over Mount Selene, painting the slopes in shades of amber and rose. Hermes sat at the cave entrance, his feet still wrapped in their leather frameworks, watching the light change. His mind had finally slowed down after the day's invention, entering that contemplative state that comes after creation. When the doing is done and only the thinking remains, what had he made, really? Not just leather and straps, but a new possibility. A new option for how feet and ground could interact. A small change that might ripple outward in ways he couldn't predict. Below him, somewhere in the darkening valleys, shepherds were bedding down for the night. In the town beyond, craftsmen were closing their shops. On Olympus, gods were finishing their evening meals. And everywhere, absolutely everywhere people were walking, their bare feet touching earth in the way feet had touched earth since humans first stood upright. But that was changing. Starting now, starting here. Starting with one bored god and some leftover goat hide. Hermes looked down at his own footprints on the dusty ground before the cave. The leather soles left clear. Stinked marks not, the smudged prints of bare feet, but crisp outlines that showed every detail of the construction. You could see where the straps crossed, where the sole was thicker, where his weight had pressed the leather into the dirt. These were new marks in an ancient world. Footprints that had never existed before. It told a new story. Not just someone walked here, but someone walked here differently. In the growing darkness, with stars beginning to emerge overhead, Hermes smiled, because he suddenly understood what his invention really meant. Not protection, not comfort, not even practical utility, though those were all part of it. No, what he'd invented was possibility itself. The possibility of walking differently. The possibility of leaving different marks. The possibility of stepping into the future wearing something that changed your relationship with the ground beneath you. That was worth inventing. That was worth a lazy afternoon of experimentation. That was worth sharing with the world. Even if the world didn't quite understand it yet, Hermes stood, his leather-clad feet making soft sounds on the stone, and went back into the cave. Tomorrow he'd make more. Tomorrow, he'd refine the design. Tomorrow, he'd share his invention more widely, show more people, explain better what he'd created. But tonight was for resting, for letting the day's creation settle into his mind, for allowing his hands to finally stop moving and his thoughts to finally quiet, though even as he settled onto his sleeping furs, even as exhaustion pulled him toward dreams. His last conscious thought was about improvements, better knots, softer leather, different strap configurations, because that was the thing about invention. It never really ended. Every creation was just the beginning of the next creation. Every answer the source of 3 new questions. The footprints you left today would be walked over. Tomorrow by footprints made differently. Made better, made by people who built on what you'd begun without even knowing your name. And that, Hermes thought as sleep finally claimed him, was exactly how it should be. Progress wasn't dramatic. It wasn't thunder and lightning. It was soft slaps of leather on earth, spreading slowly from person to person. Changing the world one step at a time, boring. Perhaps, but also beautiful, also essential, also quietly, wonderfully transformative. Morning came gently to Mount Selene, as it always did. The sun didn't burst over the horizon so much as seep into the sky. Gradual and warm, turning the world from indigo to violet to pale blue by increments. Birds began their dawn chorus not all at once, but building slowly, voice joining voice until the air was full of song. Hermes woke with purpose for the first time in weeks. Not the chaotic energy of mischief, but something steadier, the focused drive of someone with a project. His leather foot coverings lay beside his sleeping furs, where he'd carefully placed them the night before. In the growing light, they looked less strange than they had initially. The eye adjusted. The mind accepted. He strapped them on faster now. With practice, and went to find Maya. She was already awake, of course. Mothers were always awake first, performing the quiet labor that made households function. She'd been to the spring and back, the clay amphora of fresh water sitting by the fire pit. She'd gathered wild herbs from the slopes. She'd started the day's bread, the dough rising in its bowl, covered with a cloth. "Sleep well?" she asked without turning around. "I want to make more," Hermes announced. "Better ones. Different sizes for different feet." Now Maya did turn, a slight smile on her face. "I thought you might. There's more leather in the storage alcove. And I found some better thread yesterday, linen. Very strong. It'll hold stitches better than the sinew you were using." This was what good mothers did, Hermes realized. They didn't just support your ideas, they improved them. Provided resources you hadn't thought to ask for. Cleared paths you hadn't realized were blocked. He felt a surge of gratitude that was almost uncomfortable in its intensity. Gods weren't supposed to feel grateful. They were supposed to be above such mortal emotions. But he felt it anyway. "Thank you," he said simply. Maya's smile deepened. "Go on then, create." He created. For 3 days, Hermes did almost nothing but work on his foot coverings. He experimented with different leather thicknesses, different strap configurations, different methods of attachment. He made versions for different sized feet, narrow and wide, short and long, mortal and divine. He discovered that stitching was indeed superior to tying, creating more permanent, more reliable constructions. He learned that the first version had been, essentially, a lucky accident. Many of his subsequent attempts didn't work as well. Straps cut into feet. Soles slipped around. Ankle wraps came loose. But each failure taught him something, refined his understanding, brought him closer to a design that was genuinely good rather than merely functional. By the 4th morning, he had created something remarkable, a standardized design that worked for most feet with only minor adjustments. A leather sole, carefully shaped to follow the foot's natural curves, straps that crossed over the top in a specific pattern, distributing pressure evenly, an ankle wrap that held everything secure without being constrictive. Simple, elegant, effective. He'd made a dozen pairs practice pieces, really, but functional. Enough to share, to distribute, to see what happened when the invention escaped his personal sphere and entered the wider world. "You're going to show them to mortals?" Maya asked, examining one of the pairs with approval. "And gods?" Hermes said. "Anyone who'll try them. I want to see if they actually work for other people or if it's just me." "They'll work," Maya said with confidence. "You've done good work here. Real craftsmanship, not just clever invention." There was a distinction there that Hermes recognized. Clever inventions impressed people but didn't necessarily help them. Real craftsmanship served a purpose, solved problems, improved life. The lyre had been clever, invention, brilliant, novel, impressive. But these foot coverings were craftsmanship. Useful, practical, humble. In a way that felt almost revolutionary for a god known for spectacle. He gathered his collection of foot coverings. They really needed a proper name. But nothing had suggested itself yet. Tan began the descent from Mount Selene. This time, he had a destination, the market town of Phenios. Half a day's walk away, where mortals gathered to trade goods and news. The walk was pleasant. Morning air, cool and fresh, carrying the scent of pine and wild thyme. His feet, wrapped in their leather frameworks, handled the rocky path effortlessly. He noticed things he'd never noticed before, how different terrains affected his gait, how the leather provided feedback without pain, How confident he felt placing his feet without looking where they landed. This, he realized, was what his invention provided most of all: confidence. The confidence to walk boldly, to move without hesitation, to trust that your feet would handle whatever they encountered. Phenios appeared. Gradually, as he descended, first smoke from morning fires, then the sound of voices and animals, then the buildings themselves clustered in the valley where two streams met. It was a modest town, maybe 300 people, but it served as a hub for the scattered farms and shepherding communities throughout the region. Market day brought everyone together, creating a temporary density of humanity that made news and innovation spread faster than they ever could through isolated settlements. Hermes arrived mid-morning when the market was fully active. Vendors had spread their goods on blankets and tables: pottery, woven cloth, tools, livestock. People moved between the stalls, haggling, gossiping, catching up with neighbors they only saw once a week. Children ran between adult legs, playing games that had been played for generations. Dogs wandered hopefully, looking for dropped food. No one noticed Hermes at first. He was just another young man entering the market, unremarkable except for "What have you got on your feet?" The question came from a potter, an older woman with clay-stained hands and a sharp eye for unusual things. She'd been rearranging her display when Hermes passed, and something had caught her attention. "Foot coverings," Hermes said, stopping. "I made them. Leather and stitching." The potter squinted at his feet, then back at his face. "Why?" the question everyone asked. Hermes was getting better at answering it. "Try walking barefoot on gravel. Then try walking on gravel with leather protecting your feet. You'll understand. My feet are plenty tough. I'm sure they are. But these make walking more comfortable, less tiring. Let you go farther without pain." Potter considered this. Her feet, Hermes noticed, were indeed tough, calloused, and worn from decades of work. But they also showed signs of damage. Scars from old cuts, missing toenail that hadn't grown back, knots that suggested broken bones healed imperfectly. "You selling?" she asked. "Giving away, actually. Want to see if they work for other people?" Interest flickered in her eyes, not for the foot coverings themselves, but for the novelty of free goods. "I'll try them." Within minutes, a small crowd had gathered. Market crowds were like that: one person stopping to look at something interesting drew others, who drew more, until a knot of curiosity formed. Hermes found himself demonstrating his invention to a dozen people, explaining the design, showing how the straps worked, letting people examine the leather. Some were skeptical. "Waste of good leather," one shepherd declared. "My feet work fine, Aziz." Others were intrigued. "Could be useful for long journeys," a merchant mused. "I walk to Corinth and back every month. My feet are always destroyed by the end." Few were simply amused. "Next you'll be wrapping your hands," someone joked. "Then your head. We'll all walk around completely covered in leather, like strange animals."
Oh.
But several people tried them on. And those who did almost universally experienced the same revelation Hermes had. Walking felt different. Not dramatically better, perhaps, but subtly more comfortable, more confident, more controlled. "Huh," the potter said, taking a few experimental steps. She was wearing one of the smaller pairs, adjusted to fit her narrow feet. "That's actually not bad." "Told you." "Still don't know why I need it, though." "Maybe you don't," Hermes admitted. "Or maybe you don't know you need it until you've tried it for a while. Use them for a week. See if you want to go back to barefoot." The potter nodded slowly. She didn't take the foot coverings off, he noticed. Just kept wearing them, unconsciously accepting them as part of her outfit. That felt significant, though Hermes couldn't articulate exactly why. Others took pairs. The merchant who walked to Corinth, a young mother who said her feet had never recovered from her last pregnancy, an elderly man whose knees were failing and who thought cushioned soles might help, a farmer who worked fields full of sharp stubble. Not everyone. Maybe 1 in 5 took a pair, and some of those only out of politeness or curiosity rather than genuine need. But enough. Enough that when Hermes left the market an hour later, his collection of foot coverings had been completely distributed, and scattered throughout Phenios were a dozen people walking differently than they'd walked that Morning seeds planted, the spread of ideas was never dramatic. It didn't happen all at once with trumpets and proclamations. It happened like this, person by person, conversation by conversation, one adoption at a time. Someone tried something new. If it worked, they kept using it. Others noticed. Some of those others tried it. A few of them adopted it. And slowly, agonizingly slowly, from an individual perspective, but lightning fast in historical terms, the new thing became common. Hermes spent the next weeks visiting other towns, Orchomenos, Stymphalos, Mantinea, always the same pattern. Demonstrate the invention, explain its purpose, give away samples. Let people discover its value for themselves. He wasn't selling, not yet. This was the gift economy that preceded markets, sharing of innovations that benefited everyone if they truly worked. And they did work. Reports filtered back through the gossip networks that connected these mountain communities. The merchant's feet weren't blistered anymore. The mother could walk to the well without pain. The farmer noticed his feet didn't ache at the end of the day. Small improvements, barely worth mentioning. But small improvements that made daily life slightly less hard. Other craftspeople noticed. A cobbler in Mantinea, one of the old-style craftsmen who repaired sandals of the ancient design. Barely more than soles with thongs, examined Hermes, foot coverings with professional interest, and immediately saw possibilities. Better materials, refined construction, custom fitting. He started making his own versions, improving on Hermes's basic design, adding innovations the god hadn't considered. This was exactly what was supposed to happen. The inventor creates the first version, but the craftspeople who adopt it create the better versions, each one building on what came before. Each generation of the design solving problems the previous generation revealed. A weaver in Stymphalos realized that woven cloth could be incorporated into the design, creating ventilation that pure leather lacked. A hunter in the mountain villages above Orchomenos added extra straps around the ankle for better support on steep terrain. A dancer in Phenios created a version with thinner or flexible soles that allowed better feel of the ground while still providing protection. Variations multiplied. The original design branched into specialized forms, each adapted to specific needs, specific professions, specific preferences. And with each variation, basic concept, something wrapped around your foot that changed how you walked, became more embedded in the culture, more accepted as normal rather than strange. Within months, foot coverings weren't unusual anymore. They weren't everywhere most. People still went barefoot, especially in warm weather, especially for short distances, especially among those who couldn't afford leather or hadn't yet seen the point. But they existed. They were available. They were an option, and options, once created, rarely disappear. They might evolve, might transform beyond recognition, might be superseded by better options. But the possibility they represent persists. Someone, somewhere, will always be wearing them, using them, building on them. Hermes watched this spread with satisfaction and something approaching wonder. He'd made things before the lyre, various tools, countless small inventions, but he'd never watched one propagate quite like this. The lyre had been adopted quickly by professional musicians, but it remained somewhat specialized, something for artists and entertainers. But foot coverings were different. They were democratic. Anyone could use them, understand them, benefit from them. This was what technology looked like when it succeeded. Not revolution, but permeation. Not dramatic change, but gradual adoption. Not replacing what came before, but joining it as an option, an alternative, a choice. He returned to Mount Selene in the early days of autumn. When the heat was finally breaking and the first hints of coolness touched the evening air, Maya asked how his distribution had gone. Better than expected, Hermes admitted. People are actually using them, making their own versions, adapting them, so it's spreading. Slowly, but yes, spreading. Maya smiled. That's how the good ideas spread, you know? The bad ideas spread quickly. They're exciting, dramatic, appealing, but they burn out just as fast. The good ideas spread slowly, person by person, proving themselves over and over, till suddenly everyone's using them, and nobody remembers when they didn't exist. Hermes thought about that. It was true. Could he remember a time before musical instruments? Before pottery? Before agriculture itself? All had spread the same way. Gradually, carefully, proving their worth through use rather than spectacle. Maybe that was his real achievement. Not inventing something clever, but inventing something useful. Something that improved life quietly, without fanfare. In ways so subtle, they became invisible. The world was quietly changing beneath his feet, literally. And that invisible transformation would outlast any dramatic innovation he could have imagined. 5 years passed, though for Hermes the time felt both longer and shorter than that. Divine perception of time was strange. Days could drag endlessly when nothing interesting happened. Decades could blur together when you weren't paying attention. But 5 years was significant even by divine standards. Long enough for changes to root themselves, for innovations to become traditions. For the new to become the normal, Hermes foot coverings, people were calling them sandals now. From sandalian, a diminutive of something wooden. Though they weren't really wooden, it all had spread far beyond the mountain valleys of Arcadia. Trade routes carried them to coastal cities. Travelers wore them north into Thessaly and south to Sparta. Ships brought them to islands scattered across the Aegean. And everywhere they went, they changed. The basic concept remained: leather wrapped around feet. Held in place with straps, but the implementations varied wildly based on local materials, climate, profession, and fashion. In hot Egypt, sandals became minimal, a thin sole and a single thong between the toes. In rough Sparta, they became practical, thick leather reinforced with bronze studs for military use. In fashionable Athens, they became decorative, dyed leather, embossed patterns, gold-painted straps. Hermes collected examples when he traveled, which was often. As the divine messenger, he ranged across the entire Greek world and beyond, carrying messages between gods and mortals. Witnessing how his accidental invention had evolved in different hands in a workshop in Athens. He watched a master craftsman, a sandal maker. That was the new profession: custom fit, a pair for a wealthy client. The process was elaborate, tracing the foot's outline on leather, cutting the sole precisely, measuring strap lengths, testing the fit, adjusting, retesting. What Hermes had done casually in an afternoon now took hours of skilled labor. But the result was superior to his original design in every way. More comfortable, more durable, more beautiful. Where did you learn this? Hermes asked, fascinated. The craftsman glanced up briefly, not recognizing the god in his simple traveling clothes. My master taught me, who learned from his master. The technique came from Arcadia originally, I'm told, though it's been refined considerably since then. Refined how? Better stitching patterns that distribute stress. Cork inserts for cushioning. Different leathers for different parts, softer for straps, tougher for soles. Waterproofing treatments. Sizing standards, so we can make them in advance rather than custom for each customer. He smiled with professional pride. We've taken a crude idea and made it civilized. Hermes bit back a laugh. Crude idea. If only the craftsman knew he was talking to the crude idea's originator. But that was fine. That was how it should be. The original inventor didn't matter once the invention had been absorbed into culture. What mattered was what people did with it, how they improved it, where they took it next. In Corinth, he saw dock workers wearing heavy-duty versions with thick soles that protected feet from splinters and sharp shells. In Thebes, he saw athletes wearing lightweight racing sandals designed for speed. In Delphi, he saw priests wearing ceremonial versions decorated with symbols of Apollo. Each variation told a story about what people valued: practicality, speed, status, devotion. The humble foot covering had become a canvas for expressing identity, profession, class, allegiance. Something that had started as pure functionality had acquired layers of meaning, but more interesting than the sandals themselves was what they'd enabled. People walked more now. That sounded simple, but the implications were profound. With feet protected from injury and fatigue, travel became less daunting. Trade routes expanded. Pilgrimage became more common. Athletic competitions included longer foot races. Military campaigns could cover greater distances because soldiers' feet held up better. The world had literally expanded. Its effective size growing because the cost of traversing it had decreased. A journey that had seemed prohibitively difficult became merely challenging. A distance that had been impossible became possible. Hermes watched a group of travelers on the road. Between Athens and Corinth, the route he'd walked himself countless times. They were moving at a steady pace, confident and unhurried, their sandaled feet handling the rocky road without hesitation. Before his invention, this same group would have been walking more carefully, watching the ground constantly, stopping more frequently to rest sore feet, taking days longer to complete the journey. Small improvements compounding into large changes. He stopped at a roadside shrine, one of the hundreds dedicated to himself. As patron of travelers, and left an offering of wine. The shrine keeper, an old woman, accepted it with a nod. "Safe journey to you," she said automatically. Then she noticed his sandals, fine ones, god-quality leather and craftsmanship. "Those are beautiful. Athenian work." "Arcadian," Hermes lied smoothly. "Original style." "Ah, the classics." She smiled. "My grandson wants those new Spartan military ones. Says they make you walk faster." "I keep telling him, sandals don't change how fast you walk. They just protect your feet." "Maybe both are true," Hermes suggested. "Maybe protection gives you the confidence to walk faster." "Maybe." The old woman shrugged. "Either way, blessed invention. Whoever thought of it? Changed the world, I'd say, though nobody seems to remember it happening. It's like they were always here." That, Hermes reflected as he continued his journey, was the mark of a truly successful innovation. When people couldn't remember a time before it existed, when it seemed obvious and natural and inevitable, rather than clever and new, the liar was still remembered as his invention songs told the story of how he'd created it. But sandals? Those were just sandals. They'd always been there in people's minds. They were part of the natural order now. Pottery or weaving. Anonymous. Invisible. Universal, everything Hermes had thought he didn't want from an invention. He'd always craved recognition, had always made sure his clever tricks and brilliant inventions were attributed to him. But this was better. This was creation for its own sake, for the pure improvement it brought to life. Without needing his name attached, he felt oddly peaceful about it. In Olympia, he watched the athletic games, the ones that would later become the Olympics, though that name hadn't stuck yet. Runners raced barefoot in the traditional way, but their feet were healthier, better cared for because they could rest them in sandals between competitions. Wrestlers fought with fierce intensity, but walked to and from the arena in comfortable footwear. Even the spectators who'd traveled from across Greece were less exhausted because their journey had been easier. The games themselves were unchanged, but the context surrounding them, the travel, the preparation, the recovery had been quietly transformed. That evening, at a symposium hosted by a wealthy Olympian official, Hermes found himself in conversation with a philosopher, one of those humans who spent their time thinking about the nature of reality and how things worked. "Do you think," the philosopher asked, "already somewhat drunk on wine, that tools change who we are? Or do they just let us be more of what we already are?" "Both," Hermes said, "and neither. Tools create new possibilities, and new possibilities create new identities." So, sandals changed humanity? In small ways. They made us travelers instead of stay-at-homes. Made us braver about long journeys. Made foot care something to invest in rather than ignore. But we're still humans. The sandals didn't make us gods, no, Hermes agreed. But they made you more godlike. Gods go wherever they want without worry. Now, so can you if, only because your feet are protected. The philosopher pondered this. So every tool is a small step toward divinity, or a small step toward being fully human. Same thing, maybe? Was getting too philosophical for a drinking party? The conversation drifted to other topics, poetry, gossip, but the exchange stayed with Hermes. Were tools a path to transcendence? Or just a path to comfort? Perhaps that distinction didn't matter. Perhaps comfort was its own form of transcendence, freedom from suffering, from limitation, from the body's vulnerabilities. He left Olympia the next day, heading north toward Delphi. The road was long but pleasant, winding through foothills covered in oak and pine. His own feet, wrapped in the latest refinement of his original design, 5 years of improvements since that first accidental prototype, handled the journey effortlessly and everywhere along the road. He saw others walking the same way, protected, confident, enabled. Merchants with packs on their backs, pilgrims heading to shrines, messengers carrying news. Families relocating to new cities, soldiers on patrol, all walking differently than they would have 5 years ago. All benefiting from something that had started as boredom and curiosity on a lazy afternoon. The world hadn't been revolutionized. There were no dramatic before and after moments, no clear dividing line between the old way and the new. Change had been gradual, distributed across thousands of individual adoptions, each person making a small choice that aggregated into cultural transformation. This was how most progress happened, Hermes realized. Not with thunder and proclamation, but with whispers and adoption. Not through force, but through offering better options and letting people choose them freely. He'd given the world better feet, in a sense. And better feet meant a bigger world, more connection, more movement, more possibility. Not bad for an afternoon's tinkering. As he walked, Hermes composed a silent prayer of thanks, not to anyone in particular, just to the universe that had arranged circumstances so that he'd been bored on that specific afternoon, with goat hide lying nearby and restless hands that needed something to do. Gratitude for the accident, for the cascade of consequences, for the quiet way something small had become something significant. The road stretched ahead, inviting. His feet were comfortable. The day was beautiful, and somewhere in a valley behind him, a child was probably trying on their first pair of sandals, feeling that same subtle shift from barefoot to shod, experiencing that same moment of recognition that walking could be different. The cycle continuing, the innovation spreading, the world changing one step at a time, boring perhaps, but also magnificent. Hermes eventually returned to Mount Selene, as he always did between his wanderings. Home called to everyone eventually, even gods who could theoretically live anywhere. There was something about the place you started from that stayed important. That grounded you no matter how far you traveled. The path up the mountain was familiar in the way of things. You've walked 1,000 times every rock, every turn, every view committed to bodily memory rather than conscious thought. His feet knew this route, could probably walk it in absolute darkness without stumbling. Evening was falling as he climbed, the sun already behind the mountains to the west, casting everything in that soft blue-gray light that comes just before true darkness. The air was cooling rapidly, that dramatic temperature shift that happened in the mountains once the sun disappeared. Crickets were tuning up for their nightly performance. A nightjar called from somewhere in the pines. The cave entrance appeared around a familiar bend. Warm light spilling from within where Maya had lit the evening lamps. Smoke from the fire pit drifted out, carrying the smell of cooking lentils and onions, unless his nose deceived him. His stomach rumbled, despite having eaten well in Olympia. Divine bodies didn't need food, but they certainly appreciated it. "Mother," he called as he ducked inside. In the back, her voice echoed from deeper in the cave system. "Finish setting the fire, I'll be there shortly," Hermes smiled. Some things never changed. Gods might grow in power and reputation, might have temples built in their honor and prayers sent their way. But Mother still treated you like you were young and required instruction on basic household tasks. He tended the fire, adding wood from the stack near the pit, arranging it so it would burn steadily without needing constant attention. The flames grew, sending dancing shadows across the cave walls, illuminating all the familiar details: the storage alcoves, the sleeping areas, the workspace where tools and materials lived in organized chaos. His original prototype sandals still sat there. He noticed the very first pair, crude and overstrapped, barely recognizable as footwear to modern eyes. Maya had kept them, apparently, preserved as a reminder or curiosity. He picked them up, feeling the stiff leather that hadn't been worn in years. Studying the knots he'd tied that afternoon, so much had grown from this small thing. So many variations and improvements and adaptations. But this was where it started. Idle hands and leftover materials and boredom transformed into creativity. "You kept them," he said, when Maya emerged from the back chambers, carrying a pot of the lentil stew he'd smelled. "Of course I kept them." She set the pot on a trivet near the fire. "First example of something that's spread across the world, that's worth preserving. They're clumsy. They're history." She settled onto her favorite cushion, graceful despite her age, which was considerable even by divine standards. "How was your journey?" Hermes told her about what he'd seen, the variations in design, the specialized uses, the cultural adoption, the philosophical conversations. Maya listened with that particular quality of attention mothers have, hearing not just what you say but what you mean. What matters beneath the words? "So it succeeded," she said when he'd finished. "More than succeeded. It became invisible. People don't think about sandals anymore. They just wear them." "That bothers you?" "No," Hermes said, surprising himself with the honesty. "I thought it would, but it doesn't. It's actually better this way. The lyre is Hermes' invention, and that's fine. That's good. But sandals are just sandals. They belong to everyone now." Maya smiled. "You're growing up. I'm centuries old. And just now growing up?" She ladled stew into bowls, passing one to him. "Maturity isn't about age. It's about learning to let your creations go. To let them become what they need to become, rather than what you want them to be." They ate in comfortable silence for a while. The kind of quiet that exists between people who've known each other forever and don't need to fill every moment with conversation. The fire crackled. The stew was good, simple, but well-seasoned, satisfying. Outside, full darkness had fallen, and the night sounds were in full chorus. "What will you make next?" Maya asked eventually. "I don't know. Nothing, maybe. For a while at least. You'll get bored again, probably." Hermes smiled. "But I'm not bored yet. Right now, I'm tired. Content? Ready to just be still for a bit. Then be still." Maya collected the empty bowls. "The world will keep turning without your constant intervention. Let it." Good advice. Hard to follow, but good. Hermes stretched out on the furs in his sleeping alcove. Not quite ready to sleep, but not ready to do anything else either. That pleasant exhaustion that comes after long travel, when your body is tired but satisfied. When rest feels earned rather than lazy. His feet were still wrapped in sandals, the good Athenian ones he'd been wearing. He considered removing them, then decided not to. They were comfortable enough to sleep in, and besides, there was something fitting about resting in your own invention, wrapped in the thing you'd accidentally created. Through the cave entrance, he could see stars beginning to emerge, first the bright ones, then the dimmer ones, as his eyes adjusted. Then the whole magnificent scatter of them spread across the darkness. The same stars that had watched over Mount Selene for eons, the same ones that would watch for eons more. Long after his sandals had been forgotten, after his temples had crumbled, after the names of gods had been replaced by new stories, impermanence. Everything faded eventually. Even divine inventions, even clever innovations, even the comfort of protected feet. Future ages would invent better things, stranger things, things he couldn't imagine. His sandals would become relics, curiosities, ancient technology superseded by better solutions. But that was fine. That was how it should be. You didn't create for immortality. You created for now, for the improvement it brought today, for the small ways it made current life better. If your creation lasted and spread and evolved, wonderful. If it faded, well, it had still existed. It had still mattered to the people who used it. Maya's voice drifted from the front of the cave, singing softly to herself as she cleaned up from dinner. An old song, one Hermes had heard his whole life, and that voice he'd known before he knew anything else. The sound was comforting in a deep, primal way that had nothing to do with the music itself. and everything to do with association. It's with memory, with the safety of being home. His eyes grew heavy. The day's travel caught up with him all at once, that sudden wave of exhaustion that doesn't ask permission. He let it come, didn't fight it, allowed sleep to pull him down into its depths. His last conscious thought was oddly peaceful. Tomorrow would be another day. There would be more adventures, more inventions, more mischief and meaning. But tonight was for rest. Tonight was for letting go of doing and simply being. The fire burned low. The stars wheeled overhead. And on Mount Selene, in a cave halfway up the slope, a young god slept in his sandals, dreaming of roads not yet traveled and things not yet made, and all the beautiful accidents still waiting to happen. Morning came, and then another, and then a string of days that blurred together in that pleasant way of uncomplicated time. Hermes didn't rush back to his wanderings. He stayed on Selene, helping his mother with small tasks, exploring the slopes he'd roamed as a very young god, letting his mind rest from constant invention. But minds like his didn't rest for long. Ideas kept arriving, unbidden and persistent, like birds returning to a familiar perch. What if sandals had metal supports? What if you could make them waterproof? What if you could add spikes for climbing? Each idea spawned 3 more, and soon his mental workshop was full again, cluttered with possibilities. He didn't act on most of them. Some ideas were meant to be thought rather than made, existing as pure potential rather than physical objects. That was fine. Not every inspiration needed to manifest. Sometimes thinking was enough. He did make a few new pairs of sandals. Those experimental versions testing different concepts. One with a raised heel that changed how weight distributed. One with extra cushioning that made long walking even more comfortable. One with decorative patterns carved into the leather that served no functional purpose but looked beautiful. That last one interested him most. Beauty without function. Decoration for its own sake. It suggested that sandals had transcended pure utility and become art, expression, identity. People weren't just wearing them because they worked, they were wearing them because they were beautiful, because they communicated something about the wearer. One afternoon, while Hermes was carving patterns into leather, a visitor arrived at the cave. Not mortal, the presence was too bright, too substantial. Another deity, Apollo. Of course it was Apollo. Hermes' half-brother, sometime rival, sometime friend, always complicated. The sun god ducked into the cave entrance, his golden hair catching the light in a way that was probably calculated to be maximally impressive. Gods did that controlled, how light hit them. Staged their appearances for optimal drama. Hermes Apollo said with a nod. "Your mother said I'd find you here, Apollo?" Hermes set down his carving. "What brings you to Selene?" "Curiosity." Apollo settled onto a rock, managing to make even that look graceful. "I keep hearing about these sandals everyone's wearing. Heard they originated here. Thought I should investigate?" "Investigate? Or claim credit?" Hermes asked dryly. Apollo laughed. "Just investigate. Some inventions are clearly yours. I wouldn't try to claim them. But I am curious about the process. How do you do it? Come up with these things. Do what? Invent. Create. Think of things that have never existed and then make them exist." Apollo leaned forward, genuinely interested. "I create music, poetry, prophecy, but those are all variations on things that already exist in nature. Birds make music. The wind prophesies through the rustling of leaves. But your inventions? They're genuinely new. How?" Hermes considered the question. He'd never really thought about his process before, it just happened naturally, without conscious method. But Apollo was serious, not mocking or competitive. This was rare, genuine inquiry from an equal. "I don't know," Hermes admitted finally. "Things just occur to me. I'm bored or restless or curious, and my hands start moving, and something emerges. The sandals happened because I was fiddling with leather while half asleep. The lyre happened because I was playing with a tortoise shell. It's all accidents, really, but guided accidents," Apollo countered. "Purposeful randomness. You channel chaos into creation. Maybe. Hermes picked up the decorated sandal he'd been working on, showing it to Apollo. "What do you think of this?" Apollo studied it carefully, running his fingers over the carved patterns, spirals and waves and geometric shapes that suggested movement and flow. "Beautiful," he said simply. "Non-functional, but beautiful." "When did you decide sandals needed to be art?" "When I realized they'd already become art. I'm just following where the idea wants to go." "See, that's what I mean." Apollo set the sandal down. "You treat ideas like living things. You follow them rather than directing them. That's gift territory, not craft. You're channeling something." Hermes hadn't thought of it that way, but Apollo might be right. There was something almost external about the creative process, as if ideas existed independently, and he was just the conduit. The hands that translated possibility into reality. "Do you want to try them?" Hermes offered, gesturing at the various sandals scattered around the workspace. "The full experience? I mean, not just looking, but wearing." Apollo hesitated. Gods didn't usually adopt mortal innovations. There was a status thing involved, a divine pride in being above such tools. But curiosity won. He selected a well-made pair, properly his size, and began strapping them on. Hermes watched with amusement as Apollo went through the same process everyone did. Initial strangeness, gradual adjustment, tentative walking, growing confidence. It was universal, apparently. The shod experience was different enough from barefoot that everyone needed time to adapt. "These are interesting," Apollo said after a circuit of the cave. "I can see the appeal. Not necessary for divine feet, obviously, but interesting. Changes the relationship with the ground." "Exactly," Hermes said. "That's what they do. Create a new relationship. Not better or worse, just different." Apollo removed the sandals thoughtfully, setting them aside with care. "You've changed how mortals walk. That's not insignificant. Wasn't trying to change anything. Was just bored." And yet, Apollo smiled. "Intention doesn't matter as much as results. You've altered human civilization in a small but real way. That's worth acknowledging." Coming from Apollo, this was high praise. They'd competed before musically, athletically, in countless petty divine contests. But this wasn't competition. This was recognition, God to God, of genuine achievement. "Thank you," Hermes said simply. "Keep inventing," Apollo said as he rose to leave. "The world needs your particular kind of mischievous creativity. We need things that never existed before, even if we don't know we need them until they exist." He left, golden light trailing behind him like a comet's tail, and Hermes sat for a long time afterward, thinking about what had been said. Keep inventing. The world needs your particular kind of creativity. Maybe that was his role, his purpose, his divine function, to be perpetually restless, perpetually curious, perpetually making things that changed how people interacted with reality. Not grand changes, not revolutionary upheavals. It's just small innovations that aggregated into cultural evolution. He looked down at the dusty floor of the cave, where countless footprints overlapped in the soft dirt. Bare footprints from before his invention, sandaled footprints from after. Both present, both valid, both part of the story. This, he thought, was what echoes looked like in dust. Marks left behind that told the history of how things had changed. Layer upon layer, old patterns coexisting with new ones. The ground remembered everything, encoded every step, preserved every phase of evolution. And someday, far in the future, someone might excavate this cave and find those footprints and wonder about them. Wonder what they meant, what story they told, what moment of change they preserved. They might not know about the bored god and the accidental invention and the lazy afternoon that changed how the world walked, but the footprints would testify anyway. Silently and eternally, that change had happened here. That something new had entered the world. That even the smallest innovations left marks that outlasted memory. Hermes smiled and returned to his carving, adding details to the decorative sandal, making something beautiful for no reason except that beauty mattered, that expression mattered, that the act of creating was itself worthwhile, regardless of utility or necessity. The afternoon stretched ahead, warm and full of possibility. His hands moved steadily, following patterns only they understood, and in the dust at his feet, new marks joined the old ones, adding another layer to the story that the ground was patiently preserving, waiting for whoever might someday read it and wonder what it meant to walk differently, to invent accidentally, to change the world one bored afternoon at a time. Night settled over Mount Selene with the gentle finality of a door closing. Not slamming, nothing dramatic, just the quiet click of day ending and rest beginning. The transition felt natural, inevitable. Like breathing out after holding your breath just a bit too long, Hermes had spent the evening much as he'd spent the day, quietly, simply, without agenda. He'd helped Maya prepare dinner barley porridge again, with honey and dried figs. They'd eaten while watching the sunset through the cave entrance. That spectacular Mediterranean display of oranges and purples and deep crimsons that painted the clouds like divine graffiti. You're peaceful, Maya observed as they finished eating. It was statement rather than question. I am, Hermes agreed, surprised to realize it was true. For the first time in I don't know how long, creation does that. Real creation, I mean not trickery or cleverness, but making something that helps others. It settles something in the soul. Hermes considered this. He'd created many things, tools, instruments, chaos. But the sandals were different. They'd been given away rather than kept. They'd been improved by others rather than hoarded. They'd served purposes he hadn't anticipated, solving problems he hadn't known existed. Maybe that was the distinction. Selfish creation versus generous creation. Making for your own glory versus making for collective benefit. He'd always been the former. The sandals had somehow become the latter, accidentally transforming him in the process. I think I understand now, he said slowly, why some gods are content to be quiet, not seeking glory or recognition. Just existing, doing their work, letting the world turn. Maturity, Maya said with satisfaction. I knew you'd get there eventually. Outside, the stars were emerging, first hesitant, then bold, then overwhelming in their multitude. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. That impossibly dense cluster of distant suns that put mortal fires to shame. Constellations arranged themselves in familiar patterns. Orion, the Pleiades, Cassiopeia. The sky was a map, if you knew how to read it. Telling stories older than human memory, Hermes moved to his sleeping alcove. That familiar hollow in the cave wall where his furs were arranged just so, where the stone had been worn smooth by centuries of divine rest. He settled into the space like water, finding its level, his body knowing exactly how to arrange itself for comfort. His sandals, he was still wearing that. Nice Athenian purr came off finally. He untied the straps with practiced movements, freed his feet, set the sandals carefully aside. His feet tingled slightly as air hit them, that sensation of liberation that always came from removing something you'd worn all day. But they didn't feel vulnerable or exposed. They felt complete, capable, ready to walk wherever he needed to go, shod or bare, protected or exposed. The sandals had been an option, a choice, not a necessity. And knowing you had choices, that was its own form of freedom. Somewhere in the distance, an owl called, Athena's bird, wise and patient, asking its eternal question. Hermes smiled in the darkness. The owl didn't need answers. The question was enough. He closed his eyes, letting his divine vision fade into normal darkness. Sleep didn't come to gods the same way it came to mortals. Less like falling, and more like sinking. Gentle and controlled. But it was still rest, still surrender, still letting go of awareness and control. And as he sank, his mind drifted over the day, the week, the years since that first lazy afternoon when boredom had become invention. He thought about all the feet, now walking protected, all the journeys made easier, all the small improvements that had aggregated into cultural change. Not bad for an accident, not bad for idle hands and leftover leather, and a young god with nothing. Better to do, the finest achievements, he realized, often came from the least impressive origins. Grand plans usually failed, crushed under the weight of their own ambition. But small experiments, casual tinkering, accidents stumbled into by restless hands, those could change everything. Precisely because they weren't trying to. His breathing slowed. His thoughts grew softer, less distinct, blurring into the pleasant nonsense that preceded true sleep. Images drifted through his mind, roads winding through mountains, feet walking confidently, leather creaking, dust settling in footprints that told stories nobody would read, but everyone would continue. From the front of the cave, Meha's presence was a gentle warmth, a reassurance that home was here, that safety was maintained, that he could rest without worry. Mothers provided that, whether their children were mortal or divine, young or ancient. The knowledge that someone was watching, someone cared, someone would be there when you woke. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, continuing their eternal journey around the pole. Constellations turned like a great cosmic clock, marking time in ways both precise and meaningless. What did time mean to stars? What did time mean to gods? It passed, certainly. Things changed, evolved, ended. But the essence remained, constant beneath the flux. Hermes was nearly asleep now, barely conscious. Hovering in that liminal space between waking and dreaming, where thoughts became strange and meanings multiplied. He saw himself walking, but the walking was also creating. And the creating was also teaching, and the teaching was also learning. And somehow it all circled back to that afternoon on Selene, when nothing had been happening and everything had been possible. The sandals rested beside his sleeping alcove, patient and inanimate, waiting for feet to give them purpose again. But even empty, they were complete. They'd served their function today and would serve it again tomorrow. No anxiety, no urgency, just existing, ready, sufficient unto themselves. Maybe that was wisdom, being ready without being anxious, being capable without being desperate, being available without being needy. Just existing with confidence that you'd be used when needed and resting when not. His last conscious thought was about rest itself, how underrated it was, how necessary, how creative. Nothing grew in soil that was constantly worked. Seeds needed dormancy. Fields needed to lie fallow. Even gods needed to stop inventing occasionally, to simply be rather than do. And then thought dissolved entirely into sleep. That deeper rest that required no words or concepts. Just the steady rhythm of existence continuing. Breath following breath, heartbeat following heartbeat, moment following moment in an endless chain that connected all living things, mortal and divine alike. Somewhere in the valley below, a shepherd was bedding down for the night, his feet wrapped in sandals much like the ones Hermes had first made. Somewhere in Athens, a craftsman was finishing the day's work, hanging up sandals he'd spent hours perfecting. Somewhere on a ship crossing the dark wine sea, a sailor was adjusting the straps of his salt-stained footwear, preparing for the night watch, all connected by this invisible thread of shared innovation. This common tool that had spread from person to person, culture to culture, generation to generation, all benefiting from one god's bored afternoon, though none of them knew it. Though the origin story had already been forgotten, though only the sandals themselves remained as testimony, and that was fine. That was perfect, actually. The best gifts were the ones given so completely that even the giver's name was forgotten, leaving only the gift itself, pure and clean and universally available. On Mount Selene, in a cave halfway up the slope, a young god slept peacefully. His work done, his rest earned, his legacy walking on feet he'd never see across distances he'd never know, continuing to spread and evolve and improve long after he'd stopped paying attention. The fire burned down to embers. The stars completed another degree of their ancient rotation, and the world kept turning, kept walking, kept moving forward on the countless small innovations that made each generation's journey slightly easier than the last. Sleep came to gods and mortals alike, that great equalizer, that necessary darkness, that reset button for consciousness. And in that sleep, anything was possible. Dreams of new inventions, Memories of old ones. The quiet satisfaction of having made something that mattered. However small, however accidental, however far removed from the glory and drama that myths usually celebrated, this was a different kind of myth. Quiet, practical, humble. The story of sandals invented by accident, spread by utility, remembered by no one, and used by everyone. The boring myth. The sleepy story. The tale told, not with thunder, but with the soft slap of leather on earth, the gentle rhythm of walking, the patient accumulation of small steps into great journeys, and his sleep deepened into the dreamless void that even gods occasionally needed. The last ember of the fire finally died, plunging the cave into complete darkness, wrapping everything in the soft blanket of night, holding all creation in that temporary stillness that promised. Without words, that morning would come again, and with it, another chance to walk, to create, to live. To leave new footprints in the ancient dust. Rest now. Walk later. The sandals would wait. The roads would wait. The world would wait. Everything could wait until the sun turned, and feet were needed again, and the simple act of walking protected, confident, comfortable could resume its quiet transformation of civilization. Sleep now. Just sleep. The story ends as it began, with rest, with peace. With the understanding that sometimes the most important thing you can do is nothing at all. Just breathe. Just be. Just rest among the gods who are also resting, who also need silence and darkness, and the temporary cessation of responsibility. The story is over. The walking continues. But for now, in this moment, there is only sleep, deep, peaceful, complete.